Ian Underhill is here to introduce Don Gutteridge. Ian Underhill was a longtime teacher of English at South Secondary School and later on joined Western's Faculty of Education, where he taught English methods to prospective high school teachers. He is the author of a monograph on teaching Canadian literature and an anthology of Canadian prose for senior students, as well as a contributor to a scholarly book on the modern history of English teaching in Ontario. Ian Underhill.
Thank you. I am delighted to be introducing my longtime friend and former colleague, Don Gutteridge. I should add, also one of my favorite writers. But I can tell you that our friendship started on a somewhat shaky note a long time ago, when I did not know Don that well, and I had read his novel Bus Ride, and I loved it. And I was quite taken by the fact that the central character in it was named Bill Underhill. And I thought, wow, wow, isn't that wonderful? So when I saw Don, I said to him, I note that the central character is named Bill Underhill. And he said, yes, I needed a comic name for my hero. And Underhill worked perfectly. Despite that, we've been friends for a long time. I hope you noted that Don is the author of 50 books. I grew up in a town, and Don did as well, where the vast majority of the citizens had not read 50 books. The idea of writing 50 books was absolutely preposterous. Those of you who are teachers know how central his educational writing is to the profession. And those wonderful novels, the historical novels from the 19th century, the great sweeping sagas, and most recently the delightful Mark Edwards series, which combine 19th century Ontario history and just damn good mysteries. Delightful. And then there's the poetry. The early poetry, the giant sagas, Riel, Tecumseh, Coppermind, with the open-ended poetic was appropriate to it. And then Don's later work, which I will confess right up front, is my favorite. The focus is much, much narrower. It's his family and that wonderful, mythic village of Point Edward. That village is the village of Don's imagination, and it has become the iconic village for many of us. The focus, as I said, is narrower, and the poetic, I think, is beautifully appropriate. The 3-beat line, the grammatical single sentence for the whole poem, and yet, paradoxically, I think, though the focus is narrower, it has become more universal. And I think the reason for that is that he has now touched our village within. You came here to hear Don, not to hear me. So I will conclude by reading the review I wrote, very short review, for Inundations, which he's going to read from. Inundations is, quite simply, outstanding. The poems entice the reader not only to enter Gutteridge's lovingly remembered world, but to rediscover our own village within. We are taken on a seasonal and physical tour of the village with its now familiar landmarks. We are introduced to the wonderfully eccentric Dickensian characters who populated his world. We also have the vision of the poet viewing with fondness and not a little awe his own family. Don Gutteridge has taken on the role of a kindly and somewhat self-surprised guide. He leads us with breathtakingly illiterate phrases so reminiscent of Dylan Thomas into the very heart of his world and the heart of our own memories. This is a collection to be sipped slowly, like fine cognac. And so, let us sip our wine, or cognac if you have it, and listen to one of Canada's major poets, Don Gutteridge.
Yay!
Thank you, Ian, for those kind words. Can you hear me? I often have trouble with microphones, but I'm at the right distance. Good. Yeah. Great. That was very kind of you, Ian. You always do a wonderful job. And you said a number of things that I was going to say, and now I don't have to say about my poems. I'm going to read from two collections, actually. This is the 1982 volume, God's Geography, with a photograph of the main street of Point Edward on the cover. And it contains two of my favorite poems, which I tend to read at almost every reading, so I'm going to do it again. The first one has a story behind it. In 1979, I went to Lambton County for a week, visiting elementary schools with a tape recorder and a film to prompt children to write poetry. And on the Thursday of that week, as I recall, I went to Johnson Memorial Elementary School in downtown Sarnia, and I was to arrive at 1 o'clock. I arrived about 5 minutes to 1. The principal said, "The teacher will be along in a minute. Just go up and make yourself at home. The room is open." So I went up and I walked in and started to set up my equipment. I looked down the middle row, and there was a woman sitting there, an elderly woman sitting there in the last seat of the middle row. And I thought, this isn't the teacher. I took a long look and I said, "Hello, Miss McDonald." And she said, "Hello, Donald." It was my grade 3 teacher. She had seen the itinerary of my trip in the local newspaper, and she was there waiting for me. She sat through my little show and watched the children write poetry, and then we had a wonderful conversation afterwards. And she said, "You know, Don, I've been following your literary career right from the very beginning." And it was in her class that I wrote my first story. After that, we corresponded a bit, and I was so moved by the experience with her and the fact that I connected her with my very first story and her kindness, that I sat down and wrote this poem called Soothsaying for Isabel MacDonald. And me just 8, a month out of 2nd grade, offering up my first story, something in your voice bequeathing trust. Original plot, Donald, and a fine ending, your soothing review. I was instantly old, the eldest sin upon me. I blush even now to admit that last flourish stolen from the grade 3 reader. My maiden soothsaying a lie, you straightened with praise that made a writer out of me. I never look back till now, the decades gone. We exchange letters, compliments, your age deepening in you, though the hand is as bright as a new grade 3's, the trust as unaffected as when it was given without complicity. You do not say even now what I, too far to turn back, can guess. You knew the ending to every point and plot in the grade 3 reader. How long have you watched, bearing such knowledge? Withheld full praise from a dozen hopefuls better than me. It was something between us, in the unspokenness of things, Me, 8 just once, and you fixed at grade 3 for 30 years. We have kept silence long enough. Let us think of the years, all the years, bridged with words.
Wow.
The second poem from this collection is about my father, and as a young man he was a very fine hockey player. In September of 1939, he got a call from Jack Adams, who was the general manager of the Detroit Red Wings, and invited to their tryout camp. But being my dad, the next day he joined the Air Force, and we didn't see him for 5.5 years. Unfortunately, he learned many things in the Air Force, but one of the things he learned to do was drink, and that was his undoing. He died of cirrhosis of the liver at the age of 58, and I wrote this poem called Swallowing Pride, which is both a tribute to him and a lament. Swallowing Pride. The paper said they couldn't build a rink big enough to swallow his pride. My dad on skates and over ice that was ground, a gravity-giving speed, a moving not of its own, but a boy on blades making wings out of legs, arms, the heart, swelling through every muscle, drew order out of energy, designed from the chaos of the game. With a stick held like a brand, he burned the puck beyond the net, the circling boards, the crowd's containment, beyond the perfection of applause. He soared on wings the ice gave only to the young, and once, Icarus on blades, the world is rink. My dad now, in this sleazy room, chest swollen with its cirrhotic liver, hands that held the hockey stick like a brand cling to a shaking cigarette, fumble with the yellowed news clippings he's dragged through God knows how many binges, withdrawals, beverage room boastings, talking to me about the slim kid he claims was him and these nicotine photos with the queer dates on them. Tells me he's going to die in 3 months and how great it's going to be when the Observer writes up his obituary, 3 columns, picture freshly engraved. And all the old-timers who weren't killed off in the war and didn't die of puffed livers will bear his coffin through the polite applause of those who remember, however dim, the young Icarus who spurned ice with his flaming blades, his wings of unending muscle. Sits there and grins at me with nicotine teeth, sits there and pretends to swallow the pride he hasn't had since that day when they finally built a rink big enough. Now, as Ian said, the poems I've been writing for the last dozen years or so are what I call miniatures, tiny little 12 to 20 line poems, very personal poems, many of them about Point Edward, many of them about my own family and friends, and using, for the first time since I wrote poems in high school, rhyme and consonants. You might be able to hear some of it as I read them. I'm not going to introduce them the way I did the first 2 poems because the introduction would end up being longer than the poem. So I'm going to pick a little set and read through the set, starting with a series of little village poems. The first one, appropriately mentioned by Ian, is called The Village Within. We all have a village within, a place where we go when the world fails us, the home ground where every face is familiar and child size, where the streets welcome our walking and each house is a variation of our own, its idiosyncrasies known and loved just for being there from the beginning, when our eyes were as wide as any horizon, when all was new and unrehearsed. Oh, the tug of the town that gave us birth is one of the sweetest joys we know. The Point, Point Edward. Dickens would have loved the Point. The streets bristled with characters who would have been at home in Pickwick or Oliver Twist. There was Bob McCord, who haunted the beverage room, closed the joint every day at 6 on the dot, and whistled his way down the main drag. Or Ruby Carr, who rescued Rags, combing the alleys and byroads on her barnacled bike and talking to every tree she managed to miss. Or Butch McCord, who battled bullies on my behalf and taught me the meaning of boyhood friendship. Or Cap Harness, who never saw a sea-going ship or the sea, but cut the hair of the whole village between salty anecdotes. Or Harry Fisher, whose yard overflowed with elderly stoves and assorted pots, like the maelstrom of his mind and the memories of gunfire and bomb blasts on the Somme. Or Herbie Gilbert, in his tin pot Lizzie, honking his ooga ooga horn at every second passerby just to say he was alive and thriving. And there was Pussy Carr, Rip Kemsley, Long Tom Shaw, and a dozen other nicknamed denizens who made my town a place to grow up in and have your fancy tickled and fed. Eternity. Oh, what a village I was born to, where the sun over first bush rises reinvented each morning, layering its lacquered light upon streets fresh from a hushed night's dreaming. And I sally forth like a seagoing Argonaut for the ells and alleys where roses grow umbilical on barnboard fences, ablaze in rhyming red, and stiff-trunked trees are surprised by breezes breathing serenity. And I am now Earth's original cartographer, nosing amongst the byways and fractured shadow, forging for a future unhorizoned by time or eternity. Oh, I think I'll read this one. It's called Glint, for Shirley McCord, a longtime childhood friend of mine. Shirley McCord dancing the can-can as if it were France on grandfather's lawn. She lifts her legs as high as the glint in my eye and swings a deft toe chinward until a tingle of thigh peeps free. And praise the Lord, I am too far gone to think of sin and gay Paris. And I've written a number of poems about my grandfather over the years. Here's another one, Absence. When my grandfather died, I wondered how I would live out the rest of my days and find him gone from the workshop or the Saturday supper table where he listened to me recount the gun-slinging shenanigans from the afternoon's thriller. As if each word mattered, and I became for a few moments the storyteller I would soon choose to become, despite the absence of that loving ear in my desire not to be. And the last of these Point Edward poems, Home Fires. After the Christmas turkey, we gathered in the front room, cousins and all, and someone started singing, "Keep the home fires burning," with dark clouds and silver linings. The swell of the voice was loud enough to bring the boys back home, and joined soon by booming baritones and tinsel-tongued sopranos. And then my grandfather rose after a pair of cordials and sang Sweet Adeline, solo, and so soaringly his throat throbbed and his Adam's apple bobbed like an angler's cork. But under the melodious tremoring of his tenor, there lay something deep and torqued, about to be released, a yearning no home fires could put out. The middle section deals with the present time and my family and friends and various events that happened. And the first one in this series is called My Father's Eyes. You have your father's eyes, my mother says. Not certain is a compliment, but I did not inherit that Roman nose, nor the high handsomeness or so captivating to women, nor can I skate like Gretzky or a winged Pegasus, twisting defenseman in the pretzels, and my fingers do not fancy the fine-toothed saw in its willing ways with wood, nor can I whistle like Bing or strum a ukulele strings until they sing like Sinatra. but to no one's surprise, I have my father's eyes. It's a Valentine poem. I used to try and write a Valentine poem every year if I could think of one and dedicate it to my wife. And this one's called Tandem, Valentine's Day 2015. For such a long journey, we traveled in taut tandem, hand in glove. If we were a song, we would be in our halcyon years a jazz jubilee with Louis tantalizing the trumpet. And even now, when our music is diminuendo, we remain melodious, touched by tenderness, still surprised by love. And this one's called Lilac. When my grandmother died at the dead end of February, they had to break the earth apart with picks to fit the coffin in, and I felt I had been forsaken, for the woman I loved like a mother had left me with no one to turn to in my grief. The world had ceased, but I was still breathing, uprooted heart and all. And then that June I went for a last look at our house and saw there my grandfather's lilac bushes licking lavishly at the spring light. And now finally I'll finish with a series from the last part called Miscellany, because I couldn't think of anything else to call it, just a group of poems. And I've written probably 10 poems about the Garden of Eden and the fall and the loss of innocence. And this is one of them. It's called Bit. When Adam and Eve delved in God's garden, tulips bloomed in the dappled shade, and the grass grew as green as emeralds under a sky preternaturally blue. And the lucky couple helped themselves to the fruits of their labor, and all was well and fit, until one of them, against all odds, nursed an appetite for apples and bit. I've written a number of poems about the poetic process. I'll just read one of them tonight, called Pitch. Working with words all my life, I remain amazed at their willfulness, the way they engage the page as if they did not flow from the million syllables of my mind, but moved instead with their own pace and provenance. Unfazed by my paltry attempt to twist them into meaning, they hitch a ride on the tide of their own intelligence until they find their way home in the perfect pitch of a poem. This one's called September. If September were a woman, she would be as lean and lithe as an antelope leaping, her voice as lilting as the autumnal songs of robins dreaming of the blithe south. Her hair would be as yellow as goldenrod or the last of the black-eyed Susans, and her smile would mellow the lacquer of moonlight over an ink-tinted lake. She would have no regrets about springs unremembered, or the intimation of winter's coming on, content to be the loving link between the seasons. See if I can find one more to finish up on. Oh yeah, this one. This one is for my Uncle Tom, called Caress. My Uncle Tom played golf from the sinister side, and so did I. We navigated in tandem the undulant hills of the Thames Valley links, stride for stride, while I watched in avid awe the enviable arc of his irons as they feathered the ball utterly into the air, and it landed on the far green as soft as a lover's touch, and his putts were administered with a crisp caress before they brushed the bottom of the cup. We shared a passion and much more, till the day he beat a tennis ball as if it still mattered, and his heart shattered like a baffled balloon, and there would be no more affable drives to sweeten the winds above the valley of the Thames. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, and I want to say, like, don't stop. I just want to keep listening to you. So we have the question and answer period. Does anybody have a question for Don? Come on, questions or yes?
Yes, Don. How easy do you find it to shift from writing fiction to nonfiction to poetry? Do you find it difficult, often stopping and starting, as it were?
It's a very good question, but actually I've done it all my life. I started writing poetry when I was in grade 7, and then when I was in high school I started and didn't quite finish some mystery novels, and then as soon as I got into university, of course, I was essay writing, and I found the movement between the three genres really quite easy. I sit down in my chair at home and I think I'm going to write a poem today, and out comes the poem. And the novels I did the same. I would write every morning for a couple of hours until the novel was finished, and I wouldn't write any poetry. So you're right in one sense. I never mixed the two in my mind. And when I was an academic at Aldhouse College in the Faculty of Education, I did my scholarly work in the summertime, so it wouldn't interfere with my poetry and fiction writing in the wintertime. And of course I had a wonderful job and lots of time to do it.
So you kind of keep it in silos.
Yes, very much so, very much so.
Well, and the question I have to ask, how did Point Edward come to you? Tell us about Point Edward's evolution.
Oh, it's a wonderful village. I was born in Sarnia. I hate always to say that because in Point Edward we hated Sarnia. But I moved immediately to Point Edward, and I always say in my on the back of my books that I was born in Sarnia but raised in the nearby village of Point Edward. Point Edward is not only a mythic but a real interesting village. It's when you go into the village, there's a sign that says, "Welcome to Point Edward, proudly independent since 1878. Sarnia has tried to annex it 4 times in its history and failed every time because the government said there's nothing the city can offer the village that it doesn't have." So it was a wonderful place to grow up. But it was not a typical farm village, which there are very many around London. It was a port city, so that there were big ships coming in there all the time. It was a railhead as well, and in the 19th century, it was the main railhead for the Grand Trunk Western. So it has a very interesting railroad history, and of course, it's also beside a lake and a river. So that fired up my imagination. We spent so many days in Canatera Park and on the beach on Lake Huron and fishing in the river. And the rest of it, of course, is that I think probably like any small town, as Ian and I have talked about over the years, there are characters who walk the streets, and you remember them, and they get into the poems. And then suddenly, as I go, it becomes, as Ian said, a mythic village in my mind. It becomes all villages. And that's what I try to do when I write the poems. I try and make them specific, but to have some kind of universal appeal.
Thank you. Another question. Yes?
Graham Greene said that he wrote entertainments and then works which were not just entertainments. I wondered if you had the same view of your mystery stories.
Yes, I do, Bill. The mystery stories were basically to entertain me in my retirement, because I had written 8 literary novels, and I had written everything out that I had to say, and I knew when I wrote the last one in 1990 that was it. There were no more literary novels that were going to come out. So I had nothing else to do during my retirement. So I said, I've read about 800 mystery novels. Why don't I try writing one? And of course, with my interest in history, I chose the 1830s. The problem being that there were no detectives then, so I had to invent one. But yeah, you're quite right. I've been struck by that comment by Green before. And I know my agent is not happy when I make light of my mystery novels. But I don't see them as serious literature. But I try to make them as entertaining as possible. As you say, there's entertainment. So you're basically an entertainer. So in a sense, to answer this question over here, I have 4 funnels. I have an entertainment funnel as well as a poetry, scholarly, and a serious fiction funnel.
Will you be doing any more of those entertainments?
I had a plot for number 13. I've written 12 of them. I had a plot for number 13, but I suddenly realized that it was repeating a plot that I had used earlier. So
that happens when you write 50.
Yeah, that's right. So that's when I said there are no more mysteries either. And my agent kept saying, when is number 13 coming out? And I was saying, the other problem I had, which I've never had in my life before, was I had a writer's block. I did sit down at my agent's urging and tried to write number 13, but I had writer's block. I couldn't get it out. So I thought, well, that's not only the end because I can't think up any more plots. I don't think I can write any more fiction. And I haven't written a word of fiction since 2008. But I'm still writing 2 or 3 poems a week. So I'm keeping my hand in.
Okay, great questions. Alan, another question. Thank you.
So it was mentioned you've done how many books?
53.
50. 5-0.
Okay,
That's
so
a lot.
how do you maintain the drive, inspiration, or even keep interest in doing it? I mean,
I'm very lucky. I don't sweat over my writing. When I'm writing a novel, it just flows out. It takes about 4 weeks to write a whole draft of a mystery novel, and then another 6 to 8 weeks to polish it on the computer and so on. But the first flow just comes out. It either comes or it doesn't. If it doesn't come, I get up and have a cup of tea. But usually it comes. And the same with the poems. I just sit down and poems come into my head. So I've been very lucky. And the same with the scholarly work. I find that really very pleasant, and I've never sweated over it. And so I guess most writers say they sweat blood over their works, but I honestly don't. It either comes and flows, or it doesn't come at all.
So it's pretty effortless for you.
Yes, it is.
Now, can I just ask, Don, since you write 2 or 3 poems a week, what have you written in the last couple of weeks? What would be an example or a topic for the last,
Well, I wrote a poem for one of my childhood friends, Alvin Gale from Chatham. We grew up as teenagers together, and we reconnected after 50-year absence. And I wrote a poem about that, reconnecting after all that time. And I wrote another Point Edward poem about some of the characters in town. Yeah.
Another question, anybody? Yes, okay. Tom, Poet Laureate.
How long before you started writing about Point Edward? Was that something you started early in your career? And were you worried about people from Point Edward reading poems about Point Edward?
In Point Edward, they play hockey.
Yeah.
Very few people have read the poems. I wrote a long novel about the history of Point Edward called Lily's Story, and it sold about 35 copies in the Sarnia area, so I'm hoping that some of them are from Point Edward. And they wouldn't recognize themselves, but it's something an author always worries about. And of course, I've written a lot of poems about my own family, about my grandparents and my uncles and so on. And my wife has sort of dubious thoughts about whether I should be writing about the family this way. But of course, you've got to write about what's in you.
And maybe that's why it's a little bit effortless for you, because you write about what is within you and it just flows. Yeah, it flows. Another question, please. Yes, Brittany.
Do you find writing historically or about your own personal life more difficult or more?
Whether I like the historical or the personal. Well, the historical goes back to the 60s and middle 70s. Since then, all of my work has been personal in one way or the other. But the poems were not as miniature as they are now. They were more free-flowing. Like the first two I read you, they were more like that. I wrote a lot of poems like that in the 80s and early 90s. And since then, I've been writing these tiny little 12 and 15, 20-line poems with very tight rhyme and other devices that I'd never used in my life before. And I think, again, that's what keeps me going. It's a challenge to keep writing these little poems the way I'm writing them.
Well, you call them these little poems, okay? But I think we're pretty impressed with them, Don. So, any other questions? Come on. Yes, David again.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, Don, you have such a fabulous canon of work. Is there anything that you haven't accomplished as a writer that you wish you had? Something that you perhaps didn't write that you wish you had?
I always wanted to write a memoir, but I never have, because all of that has got into my stories and poems. But that's something that I wanted to do that I find hard. I have sat down and sort of thought about writing one, but I don't know how people write such beautiful memoirs using the first person. I found that very difficult. I like to write about the characters in Point Edward and my relatives and friends, rather than a few poems about myself, but not very many. Most of them are what we call projected rather than internal. I meant to read this one. I had it marked in the book. I just didn't get to it. I was going to end with this one, so this is very appropriate. It's called Ambling, Guelph, February 1961. I go back a long ways. And it's about a walk that my wife and I took near the University of Guelph on a snowy night in February. That night the snow fell as soft as rose petals on a bride's veil, and we walked through the brightening air, hand in glove, our dreams aloft, while flakes feathered your lashes and left your eyes aglow, as if the world were there without preamble to welcome lovers and their slow, passionate ambling.
Okay, thank you. Come on, final applause. Obviously, people love your work and your words and your humble nature. It was fabulous. Thank you very much, Don. And Don has graciously offered to give these books away and sign them and wish you well. So during the intermission, Don will be sitting at the table here giving away his book. Thank you very much. Thank you. They probably want to say hello. Hi.